There is a lot of enthusiasm in the private sector surrounding the SDGs and a lot of talk about this win-win notion that we can solve global challenges and at the same time create new business opportunities and increase revenues. But we know that the reality is a bit more of a mixed bag. And in a 2019 survey by the PricewaterhouseCoopers, they looked into company engagement with the SDGs in 1,141 companies in 31 countries. This is a screenshot from the SDG Talent Report, and as we can see, PricewaterhouseCoopers found that 72% of the surveyed companies globally mentioned the SDGs. And this reflects what we know, that the majority of the world's major companies are aware that there is an expectation to address sustainability issues, and not only in terms of public scrutiny, but also in a long-term perspective in the face of prospective investors. But when we go into detail, however, we see that while 7 out of 10 mention the SDGs in their public reporting, 65% of those address specific SDGs, and only 14% mention specific targets. Of these, again, only 8% mention specific SDG targets with quantitative reporting against quantitative ambitions. And we know that meaningful contributions to the SDGs will require an operationalization of how the companies are to contribute. And further, out of the companies that did mention specific SDGs, we see here an overview of which goals are prioritized by companies. And not surprisingly, goals related to decent work and economic growth, responsible production and consumption, and industry and innovation resonate with business and rank high. Also, climate action is high on the list, which is not surprising perhaps given the massive public attention that is given to this issue. We see, however, that more basic needs goals such as poverty reduction and food security are not a priority for most companies, and neither is reduced inequalities. So this highlights some of the concerns that have been raised about cherry picking of the goals, and that certain key areas will not perhaps receive the necessary attention or financing as they are not seen as that applicable or appealing to business and the private sector. There often appears to be a gap in the rhetoric and reality surrounding business contributions to the SDGs. And while we've previously seen some of the more systemic critiques of the active involvement of the private sector in the Sustainable Development Agenda, there are also some challenges related to business contributions to the SDGs within the existing framework. And one of these is how we are able to hold companies accountable for not taking action. So since the goals are non-binding and voluntary, we do not really have any way of demanding that companies align their business with the SDGs. And this makes it, of course, more difficult to hold these companies to account for not taking action. Secondly, there's the issue of cherry picking and a concern that goals that do not necessarily easily translate into business opportunities with a high return on investments might be ignored, as we also saw tendencies of in the PricewaterhouseCoopers survey. There's also an issue with securing investments in conflict areas or fragile regions where the investments might be even more needed, but investors are hesitant due to the volatility and risk in these markets. As I also mentioned earlier, there's an issue of trade-offs, and many companies lack an integrated approach to the SDGs, and they will often choose one goal as theirs without recognizing the holistic approach that is needed. And it's an important point that action on one goal cannot really be at the expense of another. And we can imagine, for instance, increased food production or renewable energy sources being developed, but that can be at the expense of, for instance, biodiversity and natural environments. It's important to mention that it is not only the private sector that makes the mistake of overlooking these trade-offs, but nonetheless, it's important to recognize that the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs requires a holistic approach to the economic, social, and environmental dimensions, and that these cannot really be separated. And further, while there's an increasing number of companies that work actively and seriously with sustainability, it's still often the case that it is treated as an add-on to normal business operations. In corporate social responsibility theory, there is a notion that it should not be about how you spend the money that you earn, but rather about how you actually earn the money in the first place. So this means sort of that the corporate sustainability is not about a one-off donation or ad hoc initiatives, but rather that the core business should be sustainable. So there can often be a lack of dedicated budgets or key performance indicators that are attached to these sustainability goals, which means that there is often a lack of strategic integration of sustainability in the business operations. Another issue is related to reporting, and that there's no real concrete mechanism for involving businesses in the voluntary national reviews that are gone through at the high-level political forums in the UN every July. So we still, to a large degree, rely on the self-reporting of companies, which can often inflate the positive impacts and omit the negative impacts that their business operations have. Also here I should mention that this is not only limited to the private sector, and the same critique can also be raised, of course, about national reporting on SDG progress. Another aspect is that still there's mainly there's an overweight of larger companies, especially multinational and transnational corporations, who have the budgets to align and frame their businesses within the SDG rhetoric. So we see that small and medium-sized enterprises have shown lesser enthusiasm for the SDG and the agenda that they represent, but that does not, of course, necessarily mean that they are less committed to sustainability. They are just perhaps not able to frame their business within this narrative. And finally, there's the issue of greenwashing or SDG washing. And as we've seen, the growing demand from the public and various stakeholders has led to the increasing pressure for companies to engage with sustainability issues. So this means that also companies who are not really acting responsibly will attempt to jump on the SDG bandwagon and frame their business in this rhetoric without actually changing their corporate practice. And I wanted to just elaborate a bit on the issue of greenwashing, which has been a known concept for many years. And there's an interesting article by Jones from 2019. And here he identifies greenwashing as existing at the intersection of discourse and praxis, ethical discourse that is contradicted by corporate praxis. And he argues that companies that are considered to be less responsible will focus on low cost and low risk sustainability strategies. So their emphasis then also in their advertising will often focus on science, innovation, and charity. So we can imagine, for instance, fossil fuel companies who are emphasizing new future technology that will help make their current business models sustainable. Philanthropic approaches and donations are also a common tactic for such companies, where they try to offset some of their bad impacts rather than addressing and trying to remove these bad impacts in the first place. More responsible companies, on the other hand, are not afraid of higher demands to business, and they rather engage with the larger issues of market transparency, political engagement, and long-term sustainability. So they often work to adapt their business models for long-term sustainability, and some companies have even lobbied for more stringent corporate regulations and encouraged consumer awareness on sustainability issues. So a famous example from advertising is that of the clothing and wildlife brand Patagonia, who advertised to their customers to not buy a certain jacket unless they really needed it. And while this, of course, drew a lot of attention to the brand, which was not exactly negative for the company, they also contributed to raising the debate around overconsumption. And we can just in contrast imagine a lot of fast fashion companies who will offer vouchers if you hand in some old clothes. But then these vouchers are supposed to be used to purchase new fast fashion clothes. And in a way, this only perpetuates the cycle of overconsumption and does not really address sustainability in a deep-rooted way. So, despite all of these challenges and criticisms of private sector involvement, there's little doubt that business and industry will be important contributors if we are to reach any of the ambitious goals or targets that the SDGs represent. And there are some measures that can be taken that could contribute to making corporate contributions to the SDGs more meaningful. And first off, there should be a clear distinction of roles and responsibilities. The SDGs are often framed in a narrative of shared responsibility and that we will all do it, it's everyone's responsibility. But that also makes it harder to assign responsibility and accountability. This applies to responsibility for implementing the 2030 agenda as a whole, but also understanding the different roles that various actors can play and should play in partnerships so that we don't all try to do the same thing, but rather play on each actor's different strengths. Secondly, companies need to operationalize their SDG commitments with clear linkages to their business strategy and key performance indicators. While it's easy to slap on a colorful SDG graphic on your sustainability report, true transformations will require a deeper engagement and a strategic approach to sustainability. Further, business should also recognize the integrated nature of the SDGs and report also on the potential negative outputs of their business operations. Companies need to be aware of trade-offs and ensure that they do not solve one problem by creating another. There should also be formalized structures for incorporating private sector contributions in the voluntary national reviews, and this to avoid the more kind of ad hoc and selective reporting that we often see in today's reports. Further, corporate engagements and business strategies for sustainability should be aligned with national and local development priorities to avoid a fragmentation of priorities and initiatives. And finally, rather than working on addressing the symptoms of current business models, businesses should work to strengthen institutions and work on a systems level along with other actors to achieve sector-wide transformations that can actually change the status quo. So while this does not address the more systemic criticism of a neoliberal approach to development, it can help in making the corporate contributions to the SDGs under the current system more meaningful.